Wickford, Rhode Island, in the fall of 1840 was a place that liked to believe it was too small for real tragedy. The streets wound lazily between whitewashed houses, each with tidy shutters and porches sagging just enough to suggest long, harmless years. The harbor swayed with the slow rhythm of fishing boats, their ropes creaking against weathered posts, and the air was thick with the mingled smells of salt water and boiled wool from the mill. People here knew each other by name and habit, who attended church, who could be relied on for help, and who might quietly take more than they gave. And yet, even in such a small place, there were corners everyone preferred not to see too clearly. On the far edge of town, where the main road thinned into a dirt track and the marshland began, stood the Bixby farm. The white clapboard house was plain but well kept, its fence straight, its barn doors freshly painted. Elijah Bixby was a solid man of 42 with a voice that carried easily over the sound of running water in his mill. His wife, Temperance, was 38, small-boned, with a face shaped in permanent mildness, the sort that made people instinctively lower their guard. Together they had built a reputation for quiet generosity. When a neighbor's cow went lame, Elijah lent him without asking for payment. When a baby was born in the colder months, Temperance appeared at the door with a blanket already stitched. Their children, there had been many, were always dressed neatly, hair brushed, manners carefully trained. In the church pews they sat in perfect stillness, their eyes forward, their hands folded. To outsiders, the Bixbys appeared almost model citizens, the kind who proved that hard work and Christian devotion could build a stable life on the edge of the marsh. But the marsh had its own way of swallowing sound, its still waters reflecting the sky without revealing the depths beneath. People passed by the Bixby property without lingering, partly because the dirt road ended there and partly because there was something about that flat expanse of reeds that made the air feel heavier. In summer, the sweet, rotten smell of the mud clung to your clothes. In winter, fog crept across the road and into the trees, making even midday feel like dusk. The first child's death came on a Monday in early October, the kind of day when frost burned off the fields by mid-morning. Temperance sent word through the minister that little Josiah had taken ill in the night and passed before the doctor could arrive. The town accepted it quietly. Children, after all, often died quickly in those days. A small coffin was built, a hymn was sung, and the child was placed in the ground. Temperance wore no veil, only a gray shawl over her shoulders, her eyes dry but softened as if by long prayer. 2 days later, another child was buried. This time it was Ruth, said to have succumbed to the same fever. Her coffin, too, was nailed shut before it left the house. The doctor had not been called until after she died. Still, no one asked questions aloud. People had seen sickness take whole families before, and besides, the Bixbys were known for their composure. Surely such calm in the face of loss could only mean they were fortified by faith. By the third funeral that week, there were murmurs in the tavern. The words marsh fever were spoken, though no one could say exactly what it was. The minister reassured his congregation that the Bixbys were in God's hands, and most accepted that as reason enough not to trouble themselves further. The Bixby house from the outside gave no sign of grief. The laundry line still sagged with fresh linens. Smoke still curled from the chimney in the evenings. Elijah was seen repairing the barn roof on Wednesday afternoon, hammering in measured, steady strokes. Temperance continued her visits to the church, placing her gloved hands over those of the widows she comforted. If the children were heard less often, it was explained away. They were unwell, resting, needing quiet. In truth, the quiet was not new. Those who had visited before remarked on it, though always with a strange admiration. In the Bixby home, meals were taken in silence, footsteps were soundless, and voices never rose. It was a kind of discipline that seemed remarkable in children, but one that now, under the weight of so many sudden deaths, began to feel like a shadow. Still, Wickford prided itself on minding its own affairs. To look too closely was to invite unpleasantness, and unpleasantness disrupted the smooth running of life. And so, as the week wore on, coffins were lowered into the earth one after another, the soil damp and dark against the pale wood. The sound of shovels striking earth echoed in the cool air, a rhythm that should have jarred but somehow did not. The marsh kept its secrets, and so did the Bixbys. No one yet knew that behind the freshly painted doors of their farm, a slow and deliberate cruelty had been at work for years. No one guessed that the calm on Temperance's face was not born of faith, but of certainty. The certainty that each burial was not an ending, but in her mind, a completion. For now Wickford would go on telling itself that death was part of life, and that the Bixbys were simply enduring more than their share. It would be some time before the town understood that endurance was not the right word at all. Chapter 2. 12 Graves in 7 Days. Word count, 850. The week began with fog that never lifted, a gray tide pressing at windows and narrowing the roads, and in that dull light the first coffin left the Bixby house without fuss, Elijah walking beside the cart while Temperance kept a steady hand on the lid as if steadying sleep. Neighbors watched from thresholds and chose distance. Asa Pike, the carpenter, prided himself on tight seams, but Elijah had built the box himself, a neat pine piece whose lid fit too perfectly to be coaxed by grief. At the church, Reverend Ward spoke of heaven being near. The grave was closed before the smell of earth could spread, and people called the speed of mercy. By Wednesday, 3 small mounds rose on the knoll, and the bell rope burned the sexton's palm from tolling. Some said marsh fever, others said ugh, because old words shrink fear. Dr. Blackstone came late to the second death and earlier to the third, and both times he found the faces washed and still, lips arranged, hair smoothed, as if sleep had been invited to stay. He pressed behind the jaw and checked the eyes, then looked away from the mouth because Temperance, with folded hands and even tone, made looking harder than turning. He wrote fever for the ledger. Elijah thanked him with a politeness that set a quiet debt between them. On Thursday, the fog thinned to a sun that showed every flaw, and under that light the fourth coffin left the yard. Asa counted nails, bothered by a thought he could not name. A line of resin along the lid seam, the kind used to seal crates, made him wonder since when mourning needed weatherproofing. Silas Crowell dug the graves and said nothing because some silences are wiser than talk, and because Elijah paid in coins wrapped 2 by 2. Temperance stepped from the cart with the same measured pace, her shawl pinned with a pale bone clasp that drew the eye like a white tooth. When Reverend Ward suggested examining one small body, Temperance lowered her lashes and said it would shame the child, and the idea withered. On Friday, a mill boy saw Elijah at first light shaving thin curls from a plank and measuring with a knotted string. By noon, another coffin stood by the back door. Isa fell along the underside and found a row of small pilot holes too neat for hurrying. The bell tolled again, the sound flattening over the marsh until even gulls flew lower. At the 6th burial, a guest lifted Temperance's shawl and showed a dark smear. More earth than blood. Perhaps nothing at all. Eyes found it and then chose not to have seen. The 7th and 8th graves were set close to save steps, and Silas shaved their edges so each looked slimmer, like narrow shoulders in a row. The markers lost individuality, plain names repeating until reading became a droning prayer. By Saturday, town moved through chores with lowered eyes and counted children at night with shaking hands. Reverend Ward returned to the Bixby house with verses marked, only to meet vinegar and lye and a shine that felt like a film. Dr. Blackstone sent for pamphlets, though he knew these deaths were not cholera. He kept his doubt folded like a letter he would never post. At dusk, Elijah walked the fence with a lantern, a small circle of light moving along the boards. Temperance wrote in a book kept beneath the flower bin, the nibs scratching softly like mice in the wall. On Sunday, the fog returned and the cemetery looked like a page half erased. 2 more graves were opened before noon. Rain began before the dirt was tamped, and the mourners scattered in a way that looked like relief. Asa spoke his puzzle to Silas. Silas shrugged because men who dig to learn the ground keep counsel. By sunset, 12 small mounds rose like a broken staircase up the knoll. There were not enough flowers, so people cut evergreen tips and laid them wet and shining, and the resin smell mixed with salt until grief and pine were the same thing. Reverend Ward stood alone and tried to count and lost track twice. In the distance came a sound like a train, though none ran near Wickford, only wind through reeds making the iron bridge sing. That night windows were latched and curtains drawn too tight. The town slept in pieces, waking to listen for nothing. At the Bixby farm, the lantern went out 1 room at a time with the order of a ceremony, and the yard settled, and the marsh took back the fog. The house remained clean and whole, as if loss had washed it rather than torn through it. By morning, the mounds held their shape under thin frost, the markers leaning already as if tired. No one said murder. No one said ritual. They called it a hard week, and then, because habit prefers small names, they called it the Week of the 12 and went on. While in the White House by the marsh, a book was closed, a shawl folded, and a man counted the nails in a tin and found with quiet satisfaction that none were missing. Neighbors remembered the Bixbys for mercies that softened hard days. Flour left in snow, a wheel fixed before it failed. A steady hand on a fevered brow. Temperance kept a basket by the door with loaves wrapped in cloth and jars labeled in neat letters. She never visited a sickbed without a rag warmed between her palms. Elijah brought timber cut to the inch and refused payment, saying the Lord kept the ledger. In church they sat like ushers of quiet, and their children held their bodies like still water, faces trained against the twitch of want. Their kindness felt like part of the town, and the town let it. She arrived before a need could show its teeth, baked for funerals without being asked, and pressed her palm over a widow's hand until the tremor slowed. Elijah sharpened scythes at dusk so fields started clean at dawn, and set mantles straight by sight alone. That was the face the town kept, and it was not a lie, only a choice. Inside, the kindness had rules. Temperance ironed shirts until seams felt like paper, laid forks so their teeth aligned, and counted stitches as if numbers could hold a storm at bay. A small book lay under a sack of salt, bound in gray cloth and tied with a ribbon that smelled of smoke. Each evening she wrote narrow notes. Who had visited, what they needed, what word had wavered, and what offering would bind them closer next time. She reads the town as hinge to oil, latches to close, fires to the bank, and feeds those needs with a smile that never cracks. Elijah kept a bench in the barn where light fell true. Tools hung in a row to guide them home. Handles were rubbed until they felt like bone. He measured twice, tested once, and kept a tin of tiny nails for toys, cupboards, and small careful boxes because precision held back chance. Together they moved like a clock, every hour named, every task begun a minute early so the house ran with a mercy that looked like love. The children learned that mercy. They rose at a soft bell, ate without clatter, crossed rooms on rug edges to spare the boards a squeak. When a cup slipped, Temperance smiled and called it a lesson, then swept the pieces with strokes that erased the event. Neighbors envied such order and said the Bixbys had found a right way to live, a way that quieted fear. Few noticed the cost, a gaze that held too long, a hand that pressed too hard at the wrist, a pause before a blessing as if measuring whether it had been earned. On a clear morning after the week of graves, Temperance carried broth to 3 houses and left a measured word at each. Her advice sounded like care and felt like rules, and the women obeyed because obedience eased the mind. Back home, she washed her hands in cool water, dried them until no drop clung, set the towel square, lifted the ribboned book, and drew a thin line under the last entry. She began a new list: candles to trim, linens to bleach, visits to make, hymns to prepare, cautions to deliver in soft voices, requests to collect that would bind hearts tighter. In the barn, Elijah planted a strip of pine and tested a lid against a rim until the seal whispered, wrote a number on a scrap, slid it beneath a tin, and brushed the bench clean. At noon, the children came from chores with clean hands and lowered eyes. They ate bread and broth, lifted bowls together, set them down together, and left as if a lesson moved their feet. From the road, the farm looked like a picture of peace. From inside, it felt like a room set for an inspection that never ended. Kindness polished every surface until it reflected nothing but itself. And in that shine, the town saw what it wanted: a family too good for harm, a mother whose care made need disappear, a father whose skill kept breakage away. What the town did not see was the shape beneath the skin, the narrow hunger that order fed, the comfort taken in silence because silence cannot accuse. And so the Bixbys moved among them like helpful weather, harmless to the eye, leaving fixed hinges, folded cloth, and the faint sense that the world was safer when one house stayed cleaner than the rest. The ledger beneath the flour bin was not a diary in the way the town might have imagined. There were no confessions of feeling, no mention of weather or harvest or the trivial tides of daily life. Its pages were lined with a slanted, economical script that wasted neither space nor ink. Across the top of each entry ran a single name, a date, and a number, not an age, but something else, a sequence that marked the child's place in a long, uninterrupted design. Beside each name, Temperance had written a method: breath trial, water chamber, window silence. Then in smaller letters, an evaluation: compliant, resistant, purified. Her handwriting was calm, unhurried, as though she were recording preserves or the temper of soap. The language was her own, but the meaning, to her, was scripture. Children, she believed, were born stained, not with visible dirt, but with a residue of fear, deceit, and defiance inherited from generations before them. Ordinary discipline could not remove such impurities. To send a soul back to God still marked by these traits was, in her mind, to send it unready, and so she had fashioned a doctrine she called purification, a process of trials that would either leave the child remade or send them cleansed into death. The first trial, the breath trial, used a small wooden chest lined with juniper branches. Elijah had built it to her measurements, tight enough to seal when the latch fell, with holes drilled low to admit only the thinnest wisp of air. A shallow iron pan set inside held a smoldering twist of juniper bark. Temperance believed the smoke carried cleansing resin, forcing the body to fight for each breath, driving impurities out through the mouth and nose. Children were kept inside until their gasps weakened to silence. Those who revived afterward were marked as ready for the next washing. Those who did not were wrapped in linen and recorded as purified. The water chamber was harsher. It was not, as one might picture, a tub or barrel, but a deep wooden trough with a lid and hinges, a modified grain chest that Elijah had sealed with wax along the edges. A child was laid inside, the lid closed, and buckets of water poured through a narrow slot until the body was submerged in icy darkness. Temperance claimed the shock drove out rebellion, In truth, it was a crude drowning that relied on the strength of the victim's lungs. Survivors were pulled out, coughing and shaking, their lips blue. Some never took air again. Window silence was a punishment she saved for those she deemed tricksters, children who smiled too easily or answered too quickly. The subject was placed on a small wooden stool before the attic's open window in the dead of night, hands bound in their lap. Behind them, a length of twine connected wrist to stool leg, so any movement pulled the body forward toward the cold gap. They were made to sit until dawn, still and unblinking, the marsh fog curling in, the smell of brine and rot settling into their clothes. It was less lethal than the other trials, but left the child hollow-eyed, compliant, stripped of whatever small warmth they had carried. The doctrine had no room for accident. Every trial was planned, measured, its length recorded in the ledger. Elijah's role was to prepare the implements, to build what Temperance's mind required. He never questioned the designs. To him the work was simply craft, the wood shaped, the joins tight, the latches smooth. Once, when a latch caught awkwardly and a child's breath returned before Temperance had judged the moment right, he spent the next day sanding and refitting until the mechanism worked like a whisper. In her own logic, these acts were not cruelty but duty. She prayed before each trial, hands folded, eyes half closed, reciting verses about purity and the kingdom of heaven. If a child died, she did not weep. She washed the body, combed the hair, and wrapped it in a shroud that smelled faintly of juniper. She told herself they were better off than the living who still carried the stain. The town, seeing only the end of the still child, the closed coffin, assumed illness. Temperance encouraged that belief with gentle remarks about the marsh air, the fevers it brought, the weakness some children never overcame. She accepted condolences as if they were small alms given to a worthy cause. The doctrine did not stop with her own blood. Over the years, she had taken in children of distant cousins, children left behind by death or poverty, children who, to the town, had been saved by her generosity. Each one became a new entry in the ledger, a new subject for her trials. They arrived with dirty feet and wary eyes. Within weeks, they moved as silently as the Bixby born. Neighbors marveled at the transformation. No one asked what it cost. The ledger thickened over time, its pages curling at the edges from the oils on her fingers. Some names had a cross beside them, her mark for those fully purified. Others were left blank at the end, an unfinished sentence waiting for its period. To her, each mark was proof of devotion, a tally not of lives taken, but of souls perfected. And so the doctrine grew, unseen, carried out in a house the town regarded as a refuge. The coffins that left its doors were not the product of accident or plague, but of deliberate ritual labor, the work of a mind convinced that death was not an end but a correction. The marsh wind carried away the smoke, the water drained through the earth, the frost sealed over footprints by morning. What remained was only the calm, unshaken kindness the town had always known, a kindness worn like a skin stretched smooth over the bones of a practice no one dared imagine. Elijah Bixby's cruelty did not carry the heat of anger. It was a cold, meticulous craft, the kind born not from impulse but from the patience of a man who understood how to make wood and metal obey his hands. In the barn, where the scent of pine shavings and oil hung heavy, he designed implements that could sit in plain sight without raising suspicion. Tools that could kill without ever looking like they were meant to. The first was the cradle box. At a glance, it looked like a common rocker for infants, its curved runners sanded smooth, its frame sturdy and well-jointed. But beneath the thin mattress lay a hinged board and a locking mechanism disguised beneath a strip of decorative molding. When the lock was triggered, The cradle's gentle rocking turned violent, a weighted lever beneath shifting until the force snapped the neck of whoever lay inside. Elijah had made it so the noise of the mechanism was no louder than a click, a sound easily hidden beneath the creak of wood. Another invention was what he called the butter press. It appeared to be a churn, its frame heavy oak, its lid domed to keep contents clean. But inside, the vertical plunger was fitted with an iron plate that, when cranked from the side, descended slower than the human eye could notice. A relentless pressure that would, over hours, crush bones and organs alike. Elijah had even routed a small channel at the base to drain away fluid, so the device could be cleaned without leaving a trace. Perhaps the most insidious was the spiral gate, a mechanism he built from discarded mill gears. To anyone else it looked like a hand-cranked wringer for drying clothes with two wooden rollers turning in tight opposite directions. But Elijah had modified the gearing so that once a hand, foot, or small limb was caught between the rollers, the device could not be reversed without a hidden release key. The roller's slow draw would crush flesh and grind bone until the limb was useless, or until the subject stopped moving entirely. He tested each design not in secret but in a manner hidden by purpose. A neighbor might pass the barn and see him working over a butter churn or fitting dowels into a cradle, never thinking to ask why the lid fit so tightly or why the screws were set flush and covered with plugs of matching wood. He spoke of durability, of making things to last, and in that small, careful town, durability was considered a virtue. The cellar beneath the house was where wood and theory met flesh. It was narrow with walls braced by beams Elijah had hewn himself, the dirt floor packed hard by years of boots. Implements were stored against the wall in a row, each under a cloth cover to keep the damp away. He and Temperance moved with the unspoken rhythm of long practice. She prepared the child, stripping them to a simple shift and binding their hair back. He adjusted the device, checking each latch, each bolt. Once the child was placed, she would step aside, her hands folded, and watch without flinching as Elijah began. There was no shouting, no rush. The process was slow, deliberate, often lasting hours. Elijah believed in pressure applied over time, in the way a constant force could wear down both body and will until the soul was, in his words, laid bare. Temperance, in turn, recorded every detail in her ledger. How long until the subject stopped moving, how their breathing changed, whether they prayed or went silent. When death came, it came quietly. The devices left no wounds that could not be explained away. A stiff neck, broken ribs from coughing too hard, bruises mistaken for the marks of illness. Elijah cleaned each tool with the same care he gave to the mill's machinery, rubbing the wood with oil until it gleamed, polishing the iron until the smell of blood was gone. The townsfolk admired his skill. They brought him broken chairs, loose cartwheels, bent hinges, and left with them fixed better than new. In the evenings, his lantern glowed behind the barn windows, a sign of diligence. No one asked what else he was building, because to ask would have been to imply mistrust, and in Wickford, mistrust was considered worse than a lie. Over time, Elijah's devices became part of the Bixby routine. Some were dismantled after use, their parts repurposed into new forms so that nothing could be traced. Others were kept intact, covered, waiting. He never spoke of them outside the house, never gave them names aloud, though Temperance's ledger preserved them with titles and sketches. It was a partnership. Her doctrine provided the purpose, and his craft ensured the means. And so the science of suffering grew more refined, hidden in the plain sight of a small, polite town. The barn doors stayed painted and square, the tools hung in perfect order, the shavings swept from the floor each night. Anyone looking in would have seen nothing more than the work of a man devoted to his trade. But for those who had been inside the cellar, had felt the slow turn of the spiral gate or the tightening lock of the cradle box, the memory would not have been of craft, but of inevitability. The sense that once Elijah Bixby's hands began their work, there was no escape but the one his wife called purification. The house did not breathe like other houses. It held its air the way a jar holds brine, still and faintly metallic, every surface arranged to keep sound from being born. And the bodies inside learned to move as if walking through a museum where touching was forbidden and noise was a kind of theft. Rugs ran in thin channels along the floor so feet could slide without waking the boards. Hinges wore a skin of tallow renewed each Thursday. And even the parlor clock had been quieted by a folded scrap pressed beneath its pendulum. So the tick died before it could become a rhythm that made anyone forget to listen for something else. Morning began with a barely rung handbell kept in Temperance's palm, not so much a note as a suggestion of one, and the children rose at that breath of sound with hands already folded and faces empty of sleep's softness, because softness made sound and sound drew the eye. Bowls were set down like eggs in straw, spoons lifted and returned in the same measured arc, bread torn at seams prepared the night before so no crust would crack, and if a cough came, it was swallowed back into the chest until tears stood in the corners of the eyes and then were wiped in a single downward motion as if erasing a word written in error. Doors were never shut. They were placed together until latch met plate without the click. And if a latch betrayed itself, Elijah filed it with a patience that felt like prayer while Temperance stood with her book open, noting that number 6 had flinched when metal touched metal. Conversation existed as instruction disguised as kindness, the way steam rises and disappears. A child who reached for a cup too quickly would hear Temperance's voice arrive like cloth laid on a table, reminding that quickness belongs to animals and saints do not startle heaven. By afternoon, the house seemed to float above its own foundations, the way a boat lifts when water goes still. And the children learned to cross rooms by the edges of carpets and the narrow seam where one plank met another, because Elijah had shown them which seams would forgive weight and which would complain. The sound most feared was not a shout, for there were none, but the night bell, a hand-crank siren he kept on a shelf beside the cellar door, a metal throat that could whisper or sing depending on how he turned it. When its small whine rose after dusk, every child in the house felt their spine turn to wire because the bell did not mean anger. It meant selection. On those nights, Temperance would touch the ledger as if checking the weather and then lift her eyes in a way that made the room smaller, and a single name would be spoken without heat or hate, only the gravity of a scheduled chore. And the chosen child would stand and smooth their shift and walk ahead of Elijah toward the stairs while the others bent their heads as if receiving a benediction they did not want. Silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a substance, a pressure that pressed against the skin and climbed into the mouth, and the children tasted it the way one tastes iron after biting the tongue. A flavor that told them whether the night would end in the attic window with fog on their cheeks or in the cellar where oil lived in the grain of the boards. Temperance kept rules like thread, invisible until pulled. No humming, no tapping, no counting aloud, no laughter unless inside the throat where it cannot be measured. And if a rule slipped, she would place 2 fingers beneath the child's chin and lift until the neck went straight and the eyes cleared. Then ask for a day of window silence as if offering a cure. The stool set before the open frame where the marsh exhaled its cold breath and the stars looked like holes punched in a lid. In winter the house shrank, wood tightening until even good boards whispered. And Elijah walked the rooms in stocking feet, marking the new complaints with a carpenter's pencil and a private satisfaction, because he loved a problem that asked for the removal of excess. He planed edges packed toe into seams. and taught the house to hold itself again while Temperance boiled linens in lye that smelled clean enough to hurt. When visitors came, Silence wore a smile and the house performed a softer version of itself, letting the clock speak in low pulses and allowing a spoon to ring the rim of a cup once before quiet resumed. Enough to prove life without surrendering control, and guests left with the comfort of order pressed into their coats like a scent they could not name. Night was the true owner of the place, bending time until hours had no edges, and in that stretched dark the children slept as if someone had laid a hand on their backs and asked them to be the surface of a pond, unbroken. A dream that moved too quickly could be felt in the sheets, and even dreams learned to slow. When a gale came in off the bay and the house moaned as all houses do, Elijah stood at the foot of the stairs and listened the way a physician listens to a chest, separating the honest voice of wind from the careless cry of wood. And if the cry reminded him of a child's mistake, he went to the cellar and fixed what had spoken. By the end of each day, the silence had done its work. It made the children invisible to themselves. It turned caution into worship, and it wrapped the house in a stillness so complete that even grief learned to glide rather than fall. And the marsh outside, hearing nothing, gave nothing back. Miriam was different. She was 12. The last of the Bixby-born still alive after the week of graves, and unlike the others, she did not bend completely to the shape Temperance wanted. She moved quietly, yes, and kept her eyes low, but there was a tension in her stillness, as if every moment she was pressing against the inside of her own skin. She learned the rules but did not believe in them, and belief was what Temperance truly sought. Miriam obeyed in body, but her mind walked elsewhere, or to the marsh, to the narrow strip of road beyond the fence, to the idea that if she could pass beyond sight, she might find a place where silence was not a law. On the third night of November, when the moon was thin enough to hide her, Miriam slipped from her bed without waiting for the night bell. She had hidden scraps of bread in the hem of her shift for 2 days, chewing them only enough to soften before swallowing, so she would have the strength to move quickly when the time came. The house was black, but she had memorized the boards that complained and slid her feet along the rugs until she reached the kitchen. The door latch was wrapped in cloth to keep it quiet. She unwound it, stepped outside, and felt the cold hit her face like a wall. She did not hesitate. The marsh was a dark sea, the frost silvering its grasses, the ground beneath treacherous with frozen mud. Miriam kept to the edges where the dirt track ran, her breath sharp in her ears. She thought of the town, of any door that might open, of any hand that might lift her inside and say she could stay. But the marsh had a way of stretching distance. What seemed close from the attic window became endless when crossed on bare feet. The cold began to bite deep, climbing her legs until her knees felt like glass. She dropped to the ground once to rub her toes, but the mud clung in a crust that would not warm. She was nearly to the split in the road, the point where a lantern from the mill could sometimes be seen, when she heard it, the low, winding groan of the night bell. It was far off, muffled by the marsh, but she knew the sound was for her. Panic flared. She tried to run, but the frost cut her feet open and the mud slowed her with each step. Behind her, a pinprick of light began to move along the fence line. Elijah with the lantern. He did not hurry. He knew the marsh. Miriam left the track and plunged into the reeds, hoping the ground would hold her weight, but it gave way to black water in places, soaking her to the knees. Her breath tore at her throat. The cold made her stumble. She could hear the soft creak of Elijah's boots in the frozen grass, not close yet, but closing. She tried to make herself smaller, to sink into the reeds, but the moon caught the pail of her shift and made it glow like a lantern. When Elijah's hand closed on her shoulder, it was not rough, but it was absolute. He pulled her up, set the lantern down so its light struck her face, and looked at her for a long moment. His eyes held no anger, only a kind of patient certainty, the look of a man who has retrieved a tool left where it shouldn't be. Miriam didn't struggle. She couldn't. The cold had already taken the fight from her. Temperance was waiting at the back door, shawl drawn tight, ledger open on the table beside her. She made no comment about the mud, just the blood from Miriam's feet, the ice on her hem. She simply turned to a fresh page and wrote the date, Miriam's name, and the words, "Fear is the last impurity to be drawn out." Then she closed the book and said that the trial would begin at dawn. Miriam spent the night in the window silence. The stool was cold enough to numb her legs within minutes, the marsh fog drifting in until her hair was damp and heavy. She kept her eyes on the horizon, searching for some sign of morning, but the dark was endless. Every rustle in the reeds, every shift in the water below felt like something watching her, waiting for her to fall forward into the cold. By the time light began to gather at the edges of the marsh, she could no longer feel her hands or feet. When Elijah came to bring her down, he lifted her as easily as a bundle of kindling. She could not stand on her own. Temperance took her to the cellar, and though Miriam's lips moved, no sound came out. The silence had settled inside her now, not as a rule but as something permanent. The breath trial that followed lasted longer than any before it. Temperance stood with her hands folded, watching for the exact moment when the shudder in Miriam's chest changed from resistance to surrender. When it was over, the ledger marked her as purified. The next day, another coffin left the Bixby house, the lid nailed shut, the size small enough for one man to carry. No one in town asked how Miriam had fallen ill so quickly, and no one noticed the faint scent of juniper that clung to the boards. In Wickford, the week of graves was already spoken of less, as if forgetting were another kind of mercy. The cemetery knoll looked smaller with 12 mounds pressed into it, the grass shaved thin by footsteps, the earth still loose enough to take a thumbprint, and by the end of that second Sunday, the funerals felt like arrangement more than grief. Temperance did not wear black. She chose the same gray shawl each time, pinned with the pale clasp that caught light like a tooth, and stood one pace behind Elijah with hands folded as if holding a thought closed. The coffins were small and identical, planed so smooth they shone in fog. Each lid held the same spacing of nails, their heads set flush and plugged because irregularity offended Elijah and death did not excuse it. Neighbors brought evergreen boughs, short hymns, and covered dishes, then went home and spoke softly of marsh fever as if naming a ghost that stays away when treated with courtesy. By the 9th burial, women stopped stitching black ribbons. By the 10th, men tipped their hats from the path without stepping onto the wet ground, acknowledging a storm at sea without boarding the boat. Dr. Blackstone attended fewer services and rewrote his notes until paper thinned, recording fever and failure of the heart. Each time his pen paused over cause, he pressed harder until the nib bit through. People said the Bixbys were strong in the Lord because they did not break. Temperance accepted this with a small tilt of the head, tasting the praise and deciding it needed only salt. It was a performance so serene that the town allowed itself to be comforted, the way a child rests when a lullaby repeats, not because the words are true, but because repetition promises mourning in proper order. When Reverend Ward once suggested opening a coffin as pastoral duty, Temperance lowered her eyes and said shame has weight and children should not carry it into the ground. The sentence settled on his chest and he did not ask again. Asa Pike, hand on a lid, felt a tiny ridge where resin had set. Knowledge rose like bile, yet he praised Elijah's workmanship because praise was a bridge he could walk without looking down. Fog turned each service into a private room. Voices died at the edge of the group and the bell's tone flattened so even grief sounded undecided. After prayers, earth was pressed with the backs of shovels to firm it, taking care not to leave footprints. Evergreen tips were set point out like arrows directing the eye away from the center. Children were kept at home. Those who asked about playmates were told they were resting with the angels, words easy to hold and hard to question. By dusk, the knoll looked tidier than in the morning, the mounds combed smooth, the markers in a line. If you did not count, it might have seemed the same place it had always been. The town's grief became tidying too. Doors closed softly, shutters latched without clack. Conversations adjusted to lighter words, and no one wished to be first to say the pace of the dead was wrong. So they smoothed the surface, and the surface held. Back at the house, Temperance wrote a single measured line in her ledger, set a small stone atop it, and smoothed the page flat. Elijah checked the barn door and the cellar hinges, blew out the lantern so the glass would not soot, and climbed the stairs, touching the wall only at points that would not mark. Morning frost laced the sod. Shovel marks looked decorative, almost festive, with the prettiness of things that do not confess. People began to avoid the path that cut close to the cemetery, not from fear but from sparing themselves discomfort, rerouting errands by 2 streets without noticing their feet had been taught. Reverend Ward preached on patience and seasons, then searched faces at the door for a name for what he felt, finding only gratitude for short sermons. Silas stopped whistling when he worked. Asa drank alone. Dr. Blackstone kept his lamp burning until his wife said he was wasting oil, and he said nothing because waste felt like the only honest thing. At the edge of town, a girl folded a ribbon into a drawer and did not take it out again. Complicity arrived in good clothes, carried a casserole, signed the book, and praised the neatness of the graves. By the time grass learned the shape of the mounds, Wickford had adjusted its language to fit a new outline of what was acceptable. They did not ask why coffins were sealed, why the doctor came late, why the mother's hands never shook. They said some families are visited harder, that a week is short when one counts by harvests, and standing straighter they spoke these things until supper. It began with land, not guilt. A narrow strip between the Bixby fence and Asa Pike's woodlot had never been marked straight. And after the week of graves, Asa asked Sheriff Alden to pace it with string and compass, not to accuse but to let numbers settle a town that had stopped trusting words. Alden was a quiet man who read ground like weather. He came with twine, a pencil stub, and a habit of seeing what others step around. The posts along the Bixby line stood too true, as if someone had measured angles with a care most men save for coffins. He followed the fence toward the house, counting strides, marking stakes, and found himself at the kitchen door because the line ran straight to it, as if the house had been pinned to the earth by a rule no one else knew. Temperance opened before he knocked. Her shawl lay smooth, her hands were clean, and her face wore the peace of someone who believes order gives them the right to be calm. He said he wanted to check the inner corner of the hearth where the footing met the wall. The request sounded like a survey, and she let him in. The parlor looked arranged for an inspection that no one had announced. The rug was beaten, the table sat square. The clock had been quieted to a small, polite pulse. On the mantel stood Elijah's carved children with bowed heads in a neat row, 12 now, each with the same shallow notch at the base where the knife had lifted and paused. The air carried juniper, the kind of clean that pretends to be mercy. Alden knelt to sight a line across the hearth and found soot brushed thin in a fan as precise as a diagram. The chimney clean-out plate showed fresh polish at the latch and a new smear of ash where a careless thumb would never reach. He eased the plate. Behind it, snug against warm brick, lay an oilcloth bundle tied with a ribbon darkened by handling. Temperance did not move to stop him. She folded her fingers and watched as one watched a clock about to strike. He slid the parcel free. Oil stained his palms. When he untied the ribbon, juniper smoke lifted as if the book breathed. Inside lay a gray cloth ledger, edges burnished by years of turning. The first page was dated 5 winters back. Every line was written in the same narrow hand, the kind that wastes neither ink nor space. Each entry began with a child's name and a date. Beside the name ran a number that was not age but order, a sequence climbing without hurry. A column titled Method followed. Breath trial, water chamber, windows silence, spiral gate, cradle box. Then came time, measured to the quarter hour, and at the far right a single word that landed like a stone, compliant, resistant, purified. Some margins bore a small cross. Tiny diagrams lived in the gutters, neat as quilt blocks. A roller's teeth, a hinge under molding, a trough lid with a narrow slot. Below each drawing, Temperance had noted turns of a crank, degrees of latch, ounces of resin, inches of water. The week of graves filled a spread like the tally of a harvest. 12 names, 12 methods, 12 times, 12 verdicts. Alden's hand faltered once over the word purified and then steadied because the page did not shake and a sheriff's duty was to match the page. He closed the book and opened it again, and it was still there. He sent Silas Crowell waiting by the fence to fetch Dr. Blackstone and Reverend Ward, not because law required them, but because to look alone felt like drowning. While he waited, he found a tin by the hearth behind folded cloth. Inside lay neat muslin pouches tied with thread. Each pouch held a small lock of hair and a paper scrap with a date and one word that matched the ledger. He set them in a line along the mantel and saw years become a row no sermon could soften. Blackstone arrived pale, hat crooked, breathing too fast for the chill. He read 3 pages and found his own name in the margins, recorded as an hour of examination. Written with the same steady hand that had measured water by the pint. Ward stood with his fingers on his lips and stared at the diagrams until purpose slid into him like a blade that does not announce itself. They went to the cellar because the book demanded it. The room was tight and straight. Implements waited under cloth. The spiral gate stood ready, its rollers oiled, its release key hidden where only the builder would reach. The cradle box rested like furniture, its runners smooth, its hinge concealed beneath decorative molding. A wooden trough with a sealed lid leaned against the wall, wax pressed hard into seams gone gray from scraping. The floor bore a shallow channel planned toward a small pit filled with clean pebbles. On a shelf sat the night bell, a hand-crank siren with its handle polished by use. Blackstone crouched by the channel and pressed a finger into wood stained faintly darker than the planks around it. His finger came away clean. Cleanliness had been labored into the grain until the grain agreed to lie. Ward whispered a prayer not to beg but to mark that a line had been crossed that language could not pull back. Temperance remained at the threshold and spoke not to defend, but to instruct. Children are born carrying weights they cannot name, she said, and trials remove those weights before they drag the soul under. Her sentences landed without heat, like a weather report for a storm that had already passed. Alden wrote none of it. He recorded what could be carried to a judge without breaking. Ledger, pouches, devices, resin odor, iron marks, pebbled drain, bell. He wrapped the book as one wraps an infant to get it through a fire and ordered the house sealed. Neighbors gathered along the fence and said nothing because words felt like trespassing against a neat yard and a woman who stood so calmly with her hands folded. Elijah came at dusk with the mill's oil in his sleeves. He saw the horse, the lamp in the parlor, and set his jaw as if measuring a crooked board he might yet save. Alden met him with the ledger under his arm. Elijah looked at the book, then at the house, then at Temperance, who had not changed her shawl. No one raised a voice. Alden said the house would be closed and the two of them would come to town. Elijah asked if he should bank the hearth and close the barn. Alden said yes. Elijah did both with tidy hands and returned without haste. Night took the yard. The marsh lifted fog. The town watched from thresholds pressed small against their own clean panes. On the sheriff's desk, the ledger lay open beside a lamp. In those narrow lines lived a voice that did not shout or shake. It simply added and added until numbers became a shape even the quietest man could not ignore. Tomorrow would bring charges and the room where words must be spoken aloud. But the turning had already happened. The town had looked away for years. The book did not. It looked and wrote and kept looking, and now it would make everyone else do the same. The courthouse smelled of damp paper and wool coats, a crowded air that made breathing feel like reading a page bound too tight. And when the doors opened for the Bixby case, the benches filled in a way that looked like duty rather than hunger. Wickford did not want a trial. Wickford wanted a correction that could be folded back into quiet. People who had cooked for wakes avoided the front rows. Men who had borrowed Elijah's tools stood along the back wall as if ready to lift something heavy and be done. The judge from Providence wore the look of a man who had seen factories burn and families lie, and still believed a room with rules could hold the worst parts of people long enough to name them. Sheriff Alden set the ledger on the clerk's table as if placing a blade edge down. Temperance and Elijah sat together, straight as plumb lines, their hands folded in the same patient clasp with which they had accepted condolences. No chains rattled. It would all be decided by paper and words. The prosecutor began with the simplest story the town had refused to tell itself. 12 graves in 7 days, coffins sealed at the house, a ledger that did not record sorrow but instructions. A cellar that contained mechanisms arranged like chores. He did not raise his voice. He recited. He pointed to the week, then to the years before it, and asked the jury to see that the week was only the harvest of a long season. Elijah represented himself because order pleased him and because he believed precision could build a bridge even over a chasm. He spoke without heat, describing wood, latches, seals, the way a good joint refuses to open when stressed. He called the devices safeguards, tools built to prevent accidents and to calm infants whose sudden jerks might steal breath. And he said the trough had been for washing linens in a house where illness had visited hard. His words were tidy and unhurried, and shaped like dovetails built to interlock. When asked about the pebbled drain and the resin at the seams, he explained drainage for cleaning and sealing against vermin. He allowed that grief had made the house efficient. He allowed nothing else. Temperance rose when invited and spoke of burdens placed on children by birth, of trials meant to lift those weights before they hardened into sin. She did not beg and did not weep. She spoke as a teacher speaks to a class that wants to leave early, giving only what is required. The room listened the way a field listens to frost, still, already changed. Dr. Blackstone testified with a tremor that humiliated him. He admitted certifying fevers because the bodies had been arranged in stillness and because suspicion had felt like profanity in that clean place. He told the jury about the faint stain in the cellar boards that would not be forgotten, about the channel planned toward the pebbled pit, about juniper and the smell that means nothing in a kitchen and everything below the floor. Reverend Ward read from the ledger without adding a single word of his own. Each term landed with the weight of a nail driven true. Asa Pike traced the bevel where a hinge hid under decorative molding and said he wished he had never learned to admire workmanship. Silas Crowell described the 12 mounds in a line that made the knoll look like a staircase. The jury was not made of strangers. They were men who had eaten the Bixby's bread, who had heard the night bell and told themselves it was a machine. They kept their faces in an obedient calm, the look of people being measured. The judge ordered the devices brought in. The spiral gate came on a dolly like a bench, the cradle box delicate as furniture. The trough on its side left a wet crescent where wax had sweated out. The jurors touched nothing but their own knees. Elijah watched with a tradesman's attention, noting where hands gripped, where bolts had polished with use. Temperance did not watch the devices. She watched the people watching them. The clerk read portions of the record. The transcript that survives is moth-eaten. But the fragments hold a tone. Measurements listed like recipes, durations marked to the quarter hour. A comment that the release key for the rollers was kept hidden. A note that window sessions were assigned for children who smiled too quickly. One line says only, Miriam Burbau's, fear to be drawn last. There is no poetry in it, only arithmetic. By the second day, the town's fear turned into etiquette. People looked at their shoes when Temperance passed and at the ceiling when Elijah spoke, as if manners could spare them from choosing. In the afternoon heat, the room smelled of oil and paper and the faint sweetness of juniper that rose again once the cradle box was opened. The prosecutor asked the jury to imagine a hand at a crank that could not be reversed. He asked them to imagine the silence required to hear a last breath. He did not shout. He invited counting. Elijah closed by saying intention is the hinge on which any act turns, and his intention had been order and prevention. He said a disciplined book is not a death roll. Temperance said she had sought to make souls lighter before winter. The jury retired at dusk, and the lamps in the corridor burned until their wicks flowered black. Outside, the fog lifted from the marsh and moved toward town like a decision already made. When the men returned near midnight, their faces carried the slackness of people who had been staring at a single point too long. The foreman spoke in a voice that sounded like a bench dragged over stone. Guilty, on all counts that a small court can number. In the rear pew, a woman began to pray in a whisper, not for the condemned, but for herself, because now there would be no safe words. In the record, someone underlined the sentence that followed the verdict. Sentencing to be set at once. And yet even here, the town tried to keep its hands clean. No cheering, no fist raised, no righteous storm. Only the shuffle of wool, the thud of a gavel, and the sense that a room with rules had done what the road and the marsh and the church had refused. The trial ended without triumph. It ended like a lid eased down and pressed until the nails found their holes, and everyone understood what would come with morning. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within the month. The words fell into the courthouse air with the weight of a stone into deep water. No splash, no visible break, only the quiet knowledge that something had sunk where it could not be reached. Temperance bowed her head slightly as if receiving a benediction, while Elijah's jaw moved once, as though testing a tooth, then settled back into its familiar stillness. Sheriff Alden led them out together, their wrists bound with plain rope, no chains, no parade. Wickford did not gather in the street to watch. People lingered inside behind curtains, eyes tracking the shadow of the wagon across their floors. The jail in Providence was a heavier place than the Bixby home, its air thick with stone dust and the slow drip of water through the walls. Elijah's cell was lit by a narrow slit in the masonry, just enough light to plane a scrap of wood, which he did almost immediately. He asked for his tools and was refused, so he used the iron rim of his cot to whittle the handle of a spoon into the bowed figure of a child, the grain rough where the blade could not smooth. By the end of the first week, 12 such figures sat on the sill, their heads inclined, hands folded against their knees. He carved the 13th more slowly, keeping it hidden until the morning of the execution. Temperance spent her days fasting, her face taking on the brittle clarity of porcelain. She asked for a Bible, received one, and marked not the verses of mercy or redemption, but the passages on trial and cleansing. returning to them with a fingertip so often the page edges darkened. She wrote a letter each evening in her tight, upright hand, addressed not to people but to the purified, naming them in sequence, describing the coldness of stone floors, the taste of prison water, and how these, too, were trials that stripped the last weights from her soul. Each letter she folded carefully and kept under her pallet. They were allowed no visitors from Wickford. Reverend Ward came once, not to offer comfort, but to see if any confession would break through the wall of their calm. He left with his eyes downcast, the echo of Temperance's voice following him down the hall. "We are not broken things, Reverend, we are finished." On the morning set for the hanging, the sky hung low with wet snow, the flakes heavy enough to fall in slow, tilting spirals. Elijah rose first, smoothing his hair with water from the tin cup, then wiping his hands dry on his trousers as though about to begin a piece of work. He handed the 13th carving to Alden, a figure smaller than the others carved without a face. "The last is for the ledger," he said, and offered no more. Temperance emerged from her cell without prompting, the gray shawl draped over her shoulders, the pale clasp fixed exactly at her collarbone. She walked to the yard with measured steps, her eyes fixed ahead as if watching something come toward her from a great distance. The gallows stood stark against the falling snow, its beams darkened by weather, the rope coiled neatly like any tool put away at night. There were no crowds, only the sheriff, the judge, 2 deputies, and the prison chaplain. The executioner adjusted the knot with the quiet precision of a man tightening a hinge. Elijah mounted the steps without assistance, placed his feet where told, and looked down at the packed earth beneath him. He did not speak. Temperance followed, her shawl settling around her like the closing of a book. When asked for final words, Elijah shook his head once, almost politely. Temperance looked toward the gray edge of the yard where snow blurred into fog. "We will be together again before the ground thaws," she said, not to the living but to whatever she saw waiting there. The trapdoors fell in unison. The snow continued to fall, softening the sound of the ropes tightening. By the time the bodies were lowered, the flakes had begun to cover their shoulders, erasing them into the yard. The sheriff recorded the time in his ledger, closed it, and left the figures Elijah had carved on the cell's windowsill. No one claimed them. That night, the snow sealed the prison yard in a perfect sheet, unmarred until morning, when the first bird landed and left a print small enough to be overlooked. The Bixby farm did not last the winter. In late February, when the marsh was locked under a crust of ice and the sky hung low with the promise of another storm, fire took the house before dawn. It began in the barn, they said, where the wind had pushed smoke back through a chimney pipe. But no one came forward to say they'd seen the first spark. By the time neighbors arrived, drawn by the smell of burning pine, the flames had swallowed the roof and were moving through the walls with the speed of something that knew exactly where it was going. The fire did not rage. It worked. It stripped the boards clean, pressed every nailhead white-hot, and dropped the roof into the cellar with a sound like a final exhale. When the embers cooled, only the stone foundation and the iron hardware of the cellar doors remained. The devices were gone. The spiral gate, the cradle box, the trough, either taken into evidence months before or eaten by the heat. Some swore the fire burned too clean for an accident, that the wind that night had been low, the snow too wet to carry flame. But the sheriff had no appetite for further inquiry. The farm was recorded as destroyed, the land left to settle into marsh grass. The graves of the 12 children became the next problem. The knoll had turned into a place people crossed themselves when passing, an act that had nothing to do with devotion and everything to do with unease. Parents avoided it when sending children on errands. Lovers no longer met there after dark. In spring, the selectmen voted to move the bodies to a communal plot at the edge of the old burying ground, citing consolidation for maintenance. There was no public notice of the reburial, only the sound of spades and damp earth one Monday morning. The coffins, all identical, all sealed, were loaded onto a wagon and taken away before noon. No markers were moved with them. At the communal plot, the coffins were stacked in a trench and covered over without individual stones. A single slab was set above, carved with the words, "In memory of the innocents taken by Providence." No names, no dates, no acknowledgement that Providence had worn a human face. In the years that followed, the Bixby name was removed from the rolls of the church and the ledgers of the mill. Children born in town were given other surnames even when their fathers bore Bixby blood. The ledger recovered from the house was kept locked in the sheriff's desk for a decade before being sent to Providence, where it was placed in a drawer too shallow to hold it comfortably. The muslin pouches containing the locks of hair disappeared before they could be entered into evidence. Some whispered they had been buried with the children, others that they were burned in the same fire that took the farm. In 1842, Rhode Island passed a modest law requiring that any child's death be examined by a physician not tied by blood to the family, and that no burial take place without 2 signatures on the cause of death. The law was spoken of as the Wickford measure in Providence, but never by that name in Wickford itself. In town, people preferred to say the change had been a sensible precaution against fever. The cemetery knoll where the children had first been buried grew over in 2 summers. Grass reclaimed the mounds. The fence posts rotted and leaned until one fell entirely. In autumn, the marsh grass spread up the slope, hiding what was left of the soil's unevenness. Only those who had stood there during the burials could still trace the pattern of the 12, a pattern they avoided looking at for too long. By the 1850s, Wickford had no buildings left that bore any sign of the Bixbys. The mill where Elijah had worked was sold, its records pulped for kindling. The church pew they had occupied was replaced during a renovation, its wood cut down for scrap. Even the lane that had once ended at their farm was rerouted to meet the main road before the marsh, so travelers no longer passed the place where the house had stood. And yet the story lingered, not in official records, but in the small, private ways people warned each other. A mother might press her child's hand a little tighter when passing through fog, whispering that the marsh takes what is not watched. An older sibling might tell a younger sibling that they must never answer a bell after dark. None of them spoke the Bixby name, but the shape of it lived in their caution. In 1871, a young man clearing brush near the old foundation found a length of iron with teeth worn smooth by turning. The blacksmith told him it was part of a gear, nothing more. The man buried it again where he'd found it, under a flat stone, and did not speak of it after. The ground there was thick with roots, but if you pressed your ear close, the marsh still carried the faint smell of juniper on certain nights. The slab in the communal plot grew lichen, its words fading until "in memory" was the only part that could be read without tracing with a fingertip. School children sometimes ran their hands over it without knowing why the stone felt colder than the ones around it. The adults never stopped them. Children could touch what grown hands no longer dared. The Bixby farm was gone, the graves moved, the names erased from town records, but the shape of their work remained. In the law, in the unmarked trench, in the habit of looking away from what stands too still. And in this, Wickford carried its legacy, not of mercy or justice, but of how evil can be erased in name yet endure in the quietest parts of a place, waiting for someone to notice the pattern and understand it was never an accident. Evil does not always arrive with the noise of boots on stairs or the clatter of broken glass. Sometimes it moves in on quiet feet, carrying warm bread and a folded blanket, speaking softly enough that you lean closer to hear. In Wickford, the Bixbys showed their faces in daylight, their hands steady on the tools of charity, their voices shaped into the rhythm of Scripture. They fit the town's picture of good people so perfectly that no one considered what might be happening in the spaces between those moments of public virtue. What they did was not the work of sudden madness. It was measured, paced, and written down. Temperance's ledger was not just a record of deaths. It was a manifesto in miniature, proof that she believed herself a servant of something higher than law, higher even than compassion. Elijah's devices were not born of rage but of craftsmanship, each curve and hinge sanded to remove any sign of haste. Together they built a system in which harm was not an accident but a goal, where each trial was a step toward what they called purification. The doctrine was never shouted. It was whispered into the bones of their home until the walls learned to keep still. The children were taught to disappear into silence long before they disappeared into the ground. The devices were made to look like furniture, like farm tools, like anything but what they truly were. This is how hidden evil survives. It cloaks itself in the familiar because the familiar is the last thing people will question. The town's part in this cannot be measured only in what it failed to see. It must also be measured in what it chose not to see. Wickford valued peace over truth, appearance over intrusion. When the first coffin left the Bixby house, no one asked to see the body. When the second came, they called it fever. By the 12th, they had learned not to ask anything at all. Each decision was small, polite, and deadly. Even after the ledger was found, after the cellar was opened and the devices brought into the light, the trial was not the cleansing the town needed. It was a transaction, a way to remove the Bixbys without examining the years that had allowed them to work. The executions ended the Bixbys' lives, but they did not end the conditions that had made them possible. Those conditions were not bars or ropes. They were silence, deference, and the unwillingness to name cruelty when it wears a kind face. The destruction of the Bixby farm, the moving of the children's graves, the erasure of their names from records. These were not only acts of closure, they were acts of forgetting. The law that followed, requiring 2 signatures for a child's death, was a thin safeguard, one that assumed oversight could replace vigilance. It could not. No law can save a community that does not want to see itself clearly. In the decades that followed, the story sank into the marsh like everything else that had touched the Bixbys. But stories do not vanish just because they are no longer spoken. They settle in other ways, in the habits people keep without knowing their origin. In Wickford, mothers still count the steps their children take on the road, still flinch at the sound of a bell after dark, still feel an unease in the fog that no sermon can lift. It would be easy to tell this story as one of monsters, to place the Bixbys outside humanity, to say they were something apart. But the truth is harder. Monsters are simple. They declare themselves. The Bixbys were not simple. They were deliberate, and they were ordinary in every way the town valued. Their evil was not in some foreign impulse. It was in the patient use of virtues everyone admired: order, skill, faith. These things, left unquestioned, became tools in the wrong hands. Hidden evil thrives not because it is invisible, but because it does not match the image we have of danger. It sits at the front pew, it brings bread to the sick, it speaks in calm tones. We expect evil to snarl. When it smiles instead, we let it pass. The Bixbys are gone, their house gone, their graves moved, their names scrubbed from ledgers. But the pattern remains, waiting to be recognized again. Not in the marsh or the cellar, but in the quiet places we trust too easily. The question that closes this story is not about the Bixbys at all. It is about the rest of us. How many moments have we passed by because the person holding them looked right, sounded right, behaved in a way that reassured us? How many times have we told ourselves not to interfere, not to be rude, not to imagine the worst? Evil does not need darkness to work. It can work in the open so long as it is polite. And as long as we believe politeness is proof of goodness, it will find its place again. So when you think of the Bixby farm, do not think of the flames or the gallows or the ledger shut in a drawer. Think of the moment when a child sat before an open window in the fog, silent because they had learned it was safer that way. Think of the people walking past, telling themselves they had no right to ask why. What do you think? Could this happen again? Because the only honest answer is that it already has somewhere in some house that looks harmless from the road, and that it will again if the only thing we guard is our comfort.